Hi there, everyone. I'm Greg Marsden. I'm going to be the chair for the session today, based at the University of Leeds. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to chair this session on shared mobilities. I think sharing is an incredibly important part of the solution. It's something we can do quickly. It's something we can do at scale. It's something that has social benefits as well as carbon benefits. So great to see some ambitious papers and inspiring paper titles in the session. So let's move straight into the first presentation from Abdellatif at the American University in Dubai on empowering mobilities and democratizing transport, how shared mobilities could save fragmented urbanism. So great, looking forward to this. Abdellatif, over to you.
Yes, just give me a second to share my screen. Hello, can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for an introduction, Greg. My name is Abdellatif Qamhaieh. I am Associate Professor of Architecture and Urbanism at American University in Dubai. I am very interested in intersectional mobilities and with social issues and social justice. And my talk today is about shared mobility in Dubai, which is kind of a new thing here, and it seems to be picking up getting a lot of attention and a lot of interest. These are usually my first slides I use to introduce Dubai and urbanity in the Gulf. And I mean, the Gulf cities are famous for large-scale urban development projects. They are famous for automobile-dependent cities usually. And of course, and obviously, they are famous for their extremely hot climate and you know, the harsh environment in the summer, which makes walking and mobility a bit more complicated unless you're in an air-conditioned vehicle. These kind of patterns of development are common in the UAE, which is where I'm based, and they're of course common in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and other surrounding countries where you know, the benefit from the oil boom in the 60s and 70s and kind of embrace modernism at the time. I think everyone knows Dubai very well, especially those from the UK. We might know Dubai very well because we have a lot of traffic between the UK and Dubai. And it's a very famous city for a lot of reasons. Some of them are very good, some of them not very good. But from a mobility perspective, it has a lot of issues related to how to move around the city. And as I said at the beginning, you're expected to move around in your personal vehicle, basically. There are, of course, introductions of transport systems, as I'll explain in a bit. But generally speaking, the car is the dominant form of transport, and this has implications on the urban form, as we will see. Of course, there's no shortage of famous projects and famous architectural works, famous tourist destinations, but anything in between is not as glamorous and not as shiny as you would expect. Issues also that you would find the research about Dubai and similar cities are issues of representation related to rights of the city. And this is one of my main areas of interest, and kind of most of my talks revolve around these issues. Economic powerhouse, 90% expatriates, rather small if you compare it to other cities around the world, 3.2 million. So it's not a large city, but it has, economically, it's quite a large city. So just some of the older areas in Dubai that you don't necessarily see all the time in the pictures. And this is Dubai Creek, where you would have sorry, just getting my pointer. You should have the, one second here. And this is all the trading ports and where some of the goods that leave these areas go towards Iran from these areas. So a lot of interesting things happening in the city, and it's quite a vibrant cosmopolitan city. Nationalities from all over the world, around, I think, 300 cultures are represented. And this is now becoming even more, like more and more nationalities are coming to the city, especially post-corona, since there's a lot of stability and a lot of economic kind of boom in the area. I cannot talk about Dubai without talking about flows of labor and migration into the city. Since its beginning, and UAE in general, and the Gulf in general, there's a lot of migration from neighboring countries which had larger populations, but not necessarily as economically thriving as the UAE, historic trade routes, but most of the migration, especially that needed for labor, so to speak, came during the oil boom in 1960s and 70s and continues until today. So when you land in some of these cities, you feel that the demographics, you don't see much of the nationals, so to speak, but you see mostly Arab expatriates. You see a lot of people from the Indian subcontinent. You see a lot of people from Southeast Asia, and of course European and different other nationalities and North Americans. But labor is one of the major facts and one of the major elements of urbanity in the Gulf, and it has a lot of impacts on the issue of rise to the city and who is represented. So traffic in Dubai is an issue, like most cities that depend on the cars. This is the border between Dubai and the nearby city of Sharjah, and this is just a typical Google Maps showing congestion in the morning. Anyone who's been there, anyone who lives in this area, has worked in the UAE, and in Dubai especially, will understand how morning rush hour, when everyone is getting in the car and going. And a lot of reasons for these kind of traffic jams relate to politics between different cities and so forth, but it's quite a significant traffic in general, and the ratio for cars per people is quite high for a city of this size. So we have around 540 cars per 1,000 residents, which is something quite high if you compare to other cities. So I am interested in shared mobility, obviously, and because they are being hailed as the solution to some of the urban problems, which are a result of the use of the cars. And use of cars is a big deal here, and it's part of car culture is very strong, and it's actually a point of pride for some people. Like this picture I'm showing here was used as a marketing for like future Dubai and all that. So cars are everywhere. And so the question I'm interested in is, what about those who don't drive cars, and how do they move around the city? And this is what I'll be trying to wrap up really quick here. I tend to have this habit of putting some references, especially for those who are interested in research about the area. About mobility and public transport, some of these references might be helpful for some. And about shared mobility, still in the region, not much about it, but you find material here about urban patterns and labor and mobility and so forth. So public transport in Dubai it takes place due to a system, the metro, which was introduced around, I think, 12, 13 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. There's a bus system, as I will see, and there's a tram system. The metro line runs from north to south in Dubai, and recently they introduced a new line that goes towards, which is with Expo Dubai 2020 site, starting in 2 weeks. Will be over here. I kind of made this map really quick, so it's not really a scientific map, but most of the blue areas are kind of low density suburban living, and the kind of orangish tend to be darker where you have more density. And but it's not I don't have exact numbers for this because some of the information is not shared, but just this quick stroll in these areas, you understand that there's a challenge to get people into public transportation. So most of the people who use public transportation in the city as of now are mostly tourists who would follow this metro line to go to those destinations, including the expo site. It has a tram system in this Dubai Marina area over here. And there is a bus system that struggles along traffic because it has no dedicated lane and so forth, and has no any kind of the ugly duckling of transportation as usual. Just to give you a figure about some figures about the numbers they share about transport here. Notice the impact of COVID in 2020, which is quite significant. Although we had a minimum lockdown, but getting on public transportation has become a problem for some. The bus system in Dubai is very old. It started in 1968 as a newspaper clipping, and it's been the most dominant form of transport for those who were of lower income, cannot afford a car, which are significant population in the city. Nowadays it's kind of a modern public transportation system, modern bus system, but still it does not have that prominence as the metro or the tram, which are again mostly geared towards tourists or people living along that metro line. Significant numbers of people riding buses. Again, impact of Corona here is very visible. I'll just go through this really quick. For those who cannot, the bus does not take them to the metro cannot benefit from the metro. Those lower incomes who live far away from metro stations, those who don't like to ride the public bus, the informal market takes care of this. We see these white buses moving around the city, which are going to be banned and illegal and so forth, and you get tickets all the time. But these usually are company buses that move people around for a specific company, but when they have some time, they will move some of the lower income workers around the city. And they're very famous for having nasty accidents, as this was the latest one where a number of people were killed. So 2 years ago, I kind of woke up in the morning and I found some interesting changes taking place. Which is that I found these in front of where I live. So these have popped up in some of the areas which are very busy with tourists and kind of the hip crowd, so to speak. And they've been quite successful. One of them is electronic bikes, e-bikes, and the other one is, of course, scooters. And you can find a lot of these seemingly kind of randomly placed systems, and I've seen a lot of people gaining interest in these, and they seem to be working very well for some. So what I did was, as part of a research project I was doing about public transportation in general, I asked some of my students, a very small sample, about, first of all, their views of public transportation. I can come back to this later on. Most of them, of course, college students, so most of them in this country drive cars. As representatives of middle class, they own cars, will drive the family car, and most of them use the metro every now and then, but they don't use any other form of transportation. For example, the bus, rarely do you hear anyone using the bus. So what I asked them to do is, as an experiment, is to go and rent some of these shared mobility systems. So I said, with the focus on the e-bikes and the electronic scooters. We also have a lot of shared mobility in the form of vehicles, but it's not really my interest here. And why I asked about these is because I felt there's a lot of interest, and a lot of, even the Regional Transportation Authority here has been marketing these as a solution for a lot of the urban problems, which I tend to agree with them to a certain point. So these are some of the comments of my students around. The original batch was around 35, 40 students, and the people who participated in the trial where they asked to go and ride some of these were around 15. And I know it's not very scientific, so to speak, but I just want to see what they thought of these. And a lot of them were very excited, because for them, they're used to riding their own car, or they use the metro on occasion if it's convenient, the weather is perfect for them, or with their friends, but otherwise mostly they are kind of car drivers or car owners. Actually, all of them have driving licenses, and they found this a very interesting thing. A lot of them took it at night, of course, because they're worried of the weather. A lot of them also had a lot of comments about the systems. They thought it was very expensive, and bikes were not suitable for some of the ladies. It was a bit heavy. Some of the people who were wearing like certain culturally kind of reflective dress code did not work with the bikes or the scooters. Some of them were working with the scooters. They don't have any place to ride properly. So the usual comments you get in shared mobility system. And the conclusion when I asked them was, would you leave your cars for this? And of course, this is kind of expected, but most of them said, no, we will not use the cars. Of course, this is just something, it's fun, it's exciting, but we don't see it as something long-term or something permanent. Now, this is my last slide. I'm not sure how I am time, but so from my understanding, from what I'm seeing around here, I mean, we have a urban environment that is a creature of the car. So very fragmented, very rather low in density, with the exception of some areas. Public transportation works for if you have a certain destination you're going to, of course, you can take the metro. If you don't live or not next to the metro station, your options for moving around either a taxi, which kind of adds to the congestion anyway, or you can get on one of the city buses, which work if you have time, but if you're in a hurry, they will not work. So I guess what the transportation agency is trying to do is to kind of market these as a solution to the shortages of the kind of the more heavier transportation systems, which I tend to kind of agree with to some extent. They work good in hotter climates, of course, some of these systems, because you get the breeze as you're driving and you don't have to pedal, as opposed to the bikes or the scooters work well. The younger generations like them, and because they're technically savvy and they all have, like their phones and applications and data plans. It's quite a straightforward process to rent any of these. It's the excitement factor and the fun factor that seems to be luring people into riding more of these, especially the scooters, systems. And I see a lot of it around where the area I am in, which is kind of a high density area. So a lot of people riding scooters going around. But it's a kind of also a well-to-do area, so to speak. So it's not everyone who can ride these. Issues where these systems don't seem to be working relate to cost. And I will get back to the main point of this paper at the end. The vast majority of people who really need these systems are those who are captive riders, who are the low-income laborers. And for them, captive riders, getting to use any of these requires a credit card, requires a smartphone, like a data package and connection, and requires, money they probably don't have. It's not expensive per se. It's around 20 AEDs per baseline, around $8 a day or $7 a day to use it. Of course, there's a limit of 60 minutes for using the rental of these, especially the scooters, is kind of a short time rental. But to get into, to be part of this system and to be able to use them, you need to have other things, as I said, like the phones and data subscriptions and the bank account, which is another tricky issue here for especially for lower income populations. And the way it stands right now, that most of these are offered by third-party companies and private companies, so it might be a challenge for them to use it. So I will conclude with this, and I will leave more, I think, for the discussion, that they are offered these systems as a kind of a checklist, I guess. We have shared mobility, but to make it more serious and more effective for the city, I think they have to really consider the broader population and how everyone can be part of it to make it more democratic, and obviously for issues related to decarbonizing transport and making it more sustainable. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks for that presentation. And we've got a couple of questions in the chat already. I was in a session yesterday which had somebody from Tier Scooters in, and I asked them about their sort of accessibility for lower income. They've got some fantastic schemes actually for cheaper access and rental for low income groups, which they're doing outside of any government intervention. So interested to see whether there's any of that going on in your context. But let's take the first question from Cyril. You mentioned the bike share and e-scooters as having success, at least in some context. What was the metric for success? The activity, or was it actually the role it was playing? So were they assessing whether it was serving the deprived demographics, or?
Well, no, I'm the one who's deciding or saying it's succeeding or not. It's not the official agencies. I have no idea. I mean, they don't share information about these things here. But success, there are some numbers about what is the ridership for shared mobility. I managed to find, but I didn't share it because it was like a kind of one number that didn't tell me what is it, scooter, e-bike, or even in the cars, which are shared also, which seems to be the most successful for like the business crowd. But for me, it's just that these popped up really quick, and I saw this excitement with people using them suddenly, which was not there before. So that's why I was considering these to be successful. And until yesterday, when I took some pictures, I could see a lot of these empty, like these bike racks, and even the scooter locations were empty. They're all rented out. So there is an excitement. I mean, they are exciting, but success in the bigger. I mean, there's no income labor riding any of these. Zero. I haven't seen any for the last 2 years, but I've seen some, like some people who don't want to use the system, like an office employee, something kind of limited income, they might actually buy one. They go and if they save and buy one of these like scooters by themselves and use them. It's not easy to use, obviously, because the infrastructure does not support it. It's kind of an afterthought at this point. So you need to dodge the traffic all the time when you're riding these, and some of my students even comment on that. But yeah, so I don't think they're successful as they could be. Let's put it that way.
Okay, well, following on from that, Tim Hagego has asked, broadly, does Dubai's inherent multiculturalism, or perhaps globalism, does it aid or hinder the acceptance of sharing on transport systems? And you talked a little bit about this, but for who? The title of your talk was about democratization. So who is this designed for, and who is it working for?
Well, it is designed for I would say some of the country's nationals and some of the well-to-do expatriates and tourists. This is the kind of the professional group. That's what they're designed for, the people working in offices in these kind of areas. But I see it, and the title democratization, democratizing like transport, I see it as a solution for the other kind of problems that are more complex to fix, which is the issue of the captive low-income people who cannot, they're not able to participate. The transport is designed not for them; it's designed for someone else. So maybe this is a solution. So I'm more of a hoping that this would be a solution for that. As for culturally, the kind of how multicultural the city is, yes, I think it does enable these systems to work, because in more conservative cities like in Sharjah or in Abu Dhabi or a bit Al Ain, which is the other one, I think that maybe for a lady to ride some of this might be a bit kind of culturally. I don't know. I think there might be some issues for them. And one of the comments my students said, I felt very uncomfortable when I was writing this on the student said. But this is a very small group, so I cannot kind of generalize. But I think being in Dubai and being part of that kind of globalized city, kind of, the culture also is reflecting that even within the locals. So they are very exposed to these things, and even Arab expatriates who tend to be mostly conservative are okay with these. So most of my students were very happy to do this.
Great. I mean, I think the evidence so far from early studies around the world is that these do tend to be used more generally by younger males of a reasonable income level. They're the predominant users. And I mean, in some senses, I think, well, we shouldn't demonize a system just because it has an attraction to a particular set of users. But the question then is, what are we providing for everyone else? If
Exactly.
you know, if it goes on to diminish services for other people, or we're not thinking about the alternatives for those groups, then I think that becomes more of a problem. And I think it's very important to hear from places like Dubai about what the cultural norms are. You know, we've got to understand how, you know, how this appeals to diverse markets, and you look to be a melting pot for that. So.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, I'll take just a last quick question from Patricia. How digital savvy are the local users? It seems the tourists are already used to interacting with these things.
They're very digitally savvy. I mean, everyone here is well connected. Everyone here is, you know, has, I don't want to say 4 cell phones, but you know, it's a well connected, well traveled, well exposed population. They know. I mean, this is for them. They've seen this in other countries also, so they've maybe used them. But here, to use them here, it's still kind of a new thing. I am waiting for that. I guess I'm hoping that at one point the usage of these things with proper infrastructure and proper kind of enabling other segments of society to use might actually help people who are waiting in the sun for the bus in 40 degrees, you know, to be able to kind of go to a closer station or metro or something to make it better. But a lot of things need to change.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for that presentation. If you could unshare your screen, we'll move on to our second speaker, Jonathan Perkis. His title's fascinating: A Primer for Vagabond Sociology, or Why Thinking Like a Hitchhiker Can Help Save the World. So it's great to have an ambitious and inspiring title on a Friday. But I think it's also a very important reminder that a lot of the things that we're looking to do with our solutions, that they're things that have been around in society in different configurations for a long period of time, and there's a lot that we can learn by thinking about that. So I'm really looking forward to this. Jonathan, over to you.
So try and share my screen. Okay, so should be getting. Right, so we're getting that.
It'll be with us in a sec. It says started screen sharing. There we are. I've got Homer Simpson.
Oh, yeah. Right, excellent. Right, okay. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Oh, good evening. Maybe if you're joining us from further around the globe. I thought I'd start with a kind of comical thing here, because there is a sort of serious dimension to this talk, and although it's a kind of quite a sort of fancy type title here, that really I want to kind of draw on the more sort of informal, the more spontaneous, and more kind of gift economically kind of related aspects of transport. So I mean, I've been researching hitchhiking for about 20 years, and across the globe, different sort of systems. So I'll try and give you a little sort of peek at, you know, where I've been kind of doing my research, and I'll provide some links at the end which we can work with. But there's part of me just thinks that actually that this, for all the work I've done, this actually summarises all of it. So I'll just give you an idea where we're going now. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about storytelling and about kind of collective memory and capacity building, because I think that's really important, because we get this thing every 10 years or even every 5 years in the West, particularly the countries that have had kind of neoliberalism kind of bit deep into it. Like, well, what happened to hitchhiking? But people aren't necessarily looking at the kind of the bigger picture about what hitchhiking and lift sharing or actually means. So I'm going to give you a little kind of potted history, and then I'll try and just kind of give you a little insight into where I kind of come from sort of sociologically, which is like the radical social movement and looking at lifestyles and doing things differently and direct democracy. It's good to hear that word deliberative democracy again. I hadn't heard that for a few years in a session earlier in the week. I think it was Rebecca's. And then I want to talk about the something which has been a real kind of cause célèbre over the years for hitchhikers, is the Polish Autostop coupon system, which ran for 35 years. And it's been very inspiring, but it's never kind of got off the ground. And it's a really good way of linking some of these issues around responding to particular needs and doing much more informal, but actually kind of practical and useful things for the sort of the social economy. I mean, I'll give you some pointers at the end as well. So I want to start with the idea. It just kind of occurred to me when I was planning the talk that I think it was just after the a Lytton in British Columbia had literally kind of gone up in smoke, and I was just, and people were kind of fleeing the town and just grabbing you know, loved ones and pets and so forth. And I was just thinking how many people, you know, somewhere in the world in the last couple of years, somebody will have stood with, you know, with a thumb out against a kind of a burning sky, burning its town or forest, and they'll have got a lift straight away, no question. And it's the sort of thing which we forget that we do these things. We forget we draw on that kind of mutual aid and that empathic tradition. When Superstorm Sandy was a mouthful, that hit in 2012, there was loads of carpooling because all the infrastructure was flooded. And Mike Bloomberg got it really in the neck for suggesting that people should be picking up strangers, and we've got to trust each other again, he said. The cultural theorist Ginger Strand wrote a piece of the New York Times saying, look, we've just got to relearn how to hitchhike and how to trust each other again, because the interstate system, she argues, has kind of created all forms of alienation, you know, even more than just kind of, you know, being behind a windscreen, as she does. So this kind of feeds into this idea about, you know, how we talk about these incidents, these moments where societies turn themselves around very quickly and start, everyone starts kind of loving each other again for a while. If there's a food crisis, sorry, there's a fuel crisis or something. And this is about important in terms of like capacity building over the generations, so we don't forget things. So one of the most irritating things about doing research on hitchhiking is everyone goes, oh, Jack Kerouac. And it's like, yeah, okay. Because in a sense, you know, that is a particular view of the individual rebellious person, rather than thinking about hitchhiking as being a form of community, a form of alternative economics. You know, it's very easy to do, and there are many places where it's practiced as a matter of course. So that's really the kind of the aspect of storytelling and cultural traditions, which I think we need to kind of put back into the debate about more informal transport systems. So, you know, we remember who we are and what we're capable of doing. Now, of course, the best example of economies to be able to turn around very fast was during the Second World War. Well, that's an American propaganda approach, not a UK one. But if you look at the debates and the copies of the Times during the 1940s, you see just how you know, official and formalised the hitchhiking was, because everyone was conserving fuel. They set up things like Help Your Neighbour scheme, which is like a kind of, it was like a London congestion charge type of situation where, you know, you got to fill up your cars. So it was just perfectly normal for people to come standing in kind of long lines outside of cities, or going out of cities and main roads, filling up your cars. And one really interesting thing, from a really easy thing, was that they did in Birmingham, which was had this thing called the Geranium Club, and it was just based on kind of, you know, visual identification. If you had a lapel badge, you were part of the club, or if you had a windscreen sticker, you were part of the club. So there are ways of kind of making you feel part of something, even though it's potentially quite a sort of scary thing to do, you know, talking to strangers. But that whole idea of civic duty was really kind of important around that. And then, of course, it doesn't fit into the post-war narrative of growth and consumerism, and that's when you start getting kind of more problems about perceptions of hitchhiking. And another really good example of what economy is doing very quickly has been in Cuba, which is like the second favorite hitchhiking example of mine. Basically, the economy that stalled when the Soviet oil money ran out in 1990. They had to turn the agriculture and the transport around very quickly. So I mean, this is a bit of a top-down and also informal way of doing, because hitchhiking was obviously fairly normal anyway. So they sort of system. You had pickup points in cities, and these folks here, amarillo means yellow jackets, so they're kind of organising lines of kind of young people, but there are only certain times of the day where this happens, so people just kind of, and there's a fee as well, so you paid a small amount for getting a lift. So that's quite an inspiring thing, which they did very quickly. Now, for the people who in the States who think that hitchhiking's dead and they work, just kind of sort of people do it as sort of psychos and strange people. Casual carpooling. This happens outside of Oakland in the Bay Area, also in Houston, and I think there might be an experiment with it in Washington DC. I'm not sure of that, but really, America's had this kind of love and hate relationship with carpooling since the 1973 oil crisis. And if you look at the graphs of kind of how many people have been part of them, it oscillates. I think 11% of journeys at one point was a high point. But thousands and thousands of people queue and go into, this is to access high occupancy vehicle lanes. I'm curious as to where the debate is on this. I posted the questions yesterday, because we've had a small experiment of that in West Yorkshire. So this kind of goes on, and this is a perfect solution to many urban problems. Just listen to about Dubai there. Yeah, I mean, can you introduce things like casual carpooling, which has a spontaneous type aspect of it as well. I'd be interested to hear comments about that from more experienced people who work in the field. Now, for the really kind of more rural areas, Germany and the Netherlands have been particularly good at introducing these Witvelbanks or liftplaats in the Netherlands, which are basically like hitchhiking shelters, and people can wait, and often linked to other transport hubs. So there is that sense that hitchhiking is just seen as another way of travelling. And I think that is particularly useful. It's often very effective in student areas. I mean, I think travel for students was made free in about 1991, but they still keep installing these things. And I think there's a plan to do some hitch apps in Brussels at the moment. That was just before the pandemic, so I'm not sure where we are on that. So moving on to maybe kind of sort of thinking more theoretically about some of this stuff. A lot of what we were talking, I know it was in Greg's initial talk, to do with how we define locale and the kind of characteristics of locale and what kind of things would be suitable from a transport perspective. This is a map of the best places to hitchhike in Europe. And this was put together by a Hungarian hitchhiker called Abdellatif, who drew on information which is submitted to hitchwiki.org, which is the premier hitchhiking site in the world. And this is kind of interesting sociologically, because as I was indicating, in the Netherlands, yeah, brilliant. Ireland, you'd expect that, lots of tourists, slower pace of life. But what made me think, when you're looking at places like Spain's very rural, a lot of those areas which you're not supposed to be good, or it's mountainous. But Spain has got a great left-wing tradition and solidarities with marginal peoples and separatist stuff. You think, well, hang on, surely hitchhiking would work there. So what made me think as a sociologist is, well, what is this actually measuring? Because one of the things we do need to think about, as we've been talking throughout the week, is is place-based. What is appropriate? How can we look at a whole region and think what would work best where? So I think that was a pretty good. I actually found that map on the World Economic Forum website, which is quite a wild one, really. Okay, so my kind of vagabond sociology stuff, which I've written about, and you can follow up references if you're interested. I've kind of used different kind of variables, I suppose, to look at society. And one of the things which is key for me really is, when we look at a place, a region, how much does it facilitate transport cooperation? Because there's all those things about commuting and democracy and commuter towns and participation, and these are important issues in terms of making people feel sort of linked to their locality. And I think also stuff like kind of layers of bureaucracy, how easy it is for people to travel. How many, I mean, the joke there is you have to insure your thumb before setting out. I mean, there are lots, even maybe there's people who've been talking about e-scooters, that is interesting, the different kind of layers of administration, how easy or not, things like that. So what I'm interested in is thinking about, the things which inhibit people from traveling. And also that thing about how our attitudes to one another. You know, are we good ambassadors as travellers? Does travel really mean community, or is it still very instrumental, getting from place to place? And I'm always kind of concerned about kind of the speed of travel, because I think that does lead to kind of forms of alienation if we're just jetting through places. So unsurprisingly, I'm not interested in kind of great big top-down type of plans for transport. I'm much more kind of bottom up. Everybody, well, a lot of people I think probably heard of Jane Jacobs' famous book Death and Life of Great American Cities. James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State. It's all about respecting the local cultures, the practical knowledge is using what resources are there, which will make things applicable. And so in terms of how we might think about that in terms of economics, we were talking about, the problem about, kind of capitalism and having everything having a money tag on it. Well, GDP as a concept is kind of just hanging in there really for dear life as far as I'm concerned, because we're now realizing that that doesn't really work. So I like to think about the experiential value of transactions, and hitchhiking and local car sharing, they're tapping into other things. The Russians have got a word called Qamhaieh, which means exchanges without money, where you're put in front and center all the kind of social interactions, and what you gain from conversation. The conversation could be very therapeutic, or just check football scores. So I'm interested in the idea of kind of gift economy as alongside the formal economy, and these are the sort of things which come to the fore in moments of kind of cultural crisis, when economies collapse and so forth, and suddenly everyone's in their neighbours and they're sharing things. And we're thinking about economics differently. Those of you familiar with David Graeber, the sadly departed anthropologist, talks about economics as a total social phenomena. So we're needing to be thinking about kind of beyond the kind of profit motive, sort of simplicity of exchange and use value, to more kind of concepts, more kind of local alternative economic systems, certainly when kind of capitalism is kind of fragmenting in numbers of different ways. So I suppose one of the ways which I'm interested in thinking about this is through the what ran between 1957 and 1995 in Poland, was it's called the Action Autostop system. And this was a way of galvanizing Poland had a hitchhiking tradition, but it also got cut to pieces in terms of the land area after the Second World War, whole things about national identity. And the progressive head of state, Gromulka, had this hit upon this idea, and it came from him actually, of trying to encourage people to travel around the country, and incentivizing people to do that economically, and in terms of their learning about their new country, as it were. So you basically could purchase from quite a small price a book of vouchers from like the tourist board or youth clubs and so forth, and you could drivers would you'd stick your thumb out, you'd get a lift, and you would hand your coupons over to the drivers, who would then kind of cash them into like a national lottery, or it might go against kind of car insurance, or some of the kind of like local or national economic kind of condition or something. So this really struck me as being something which I'm interested to hear what Patrice is saying about kind of rural economies, because when we're thinking about need and sort of spontaneity and complexity of journeys, having forms of travel which are quite informal but also really beneficial in terms of kind of keeping kind of money in the area, but keeping people active, participants in their communities. This sort of struck me as being a really interesting idea to explore. And certainly when I was writing, doing some of the research for this, there've been a couple of attempts to set this up, but they've one in California in 1973, because there's also so much hitchhiking going on there at the time. Unfortunately, J. Edgar Hoover was actually waging war against hitchhikers at the time, and that wasn't very successful. And more recently, in 2013, this was tried as a sort of safety measure, really, in British Columbia, There's familiar with the highway of tears, disappearances, and issues around First Nation persecution. So what struck me today, because obviously then there may well be kind of questions to do, well, what about safety? Doing things like this, like that kind of voucher system, people have theorized about, how you use IT for something like this. Hitchhikers often text number plates of cars that pick them up. That's kind of part of the course these days. So I was thinking about, how we could be, using some of this stuff in rural places. I did some of my writing of my book in Dumfries and Galloway, and we saw a few people hitchhiking at the time, and it just occurred to me, people driving 30 miles to supermarkets. There's no many shops in their own communities. How can you find ways of building communities, supporting local businesses, through things like these kind of keep coupons? We heard in the discussion yesterday about climate points. Yeah, climate points, that sounds really good, but as long as we know the climate points actually have beneficial to the people on the ground and not to big corporations, or it's going in somebody's kind of share dividend. So I think there's some real potential here for dealing with a lot of the issues we've talked about. And I mean, dealing with all the hitchhiking issues in a country which is not particularly well versed in it at the moment is tricky. But the Automobile Association did reckon that there are parts of Britain which are particularly good at being sympathetic to picking people up. Of course,
1 minute now, Jonathan.
Okay, that's fine. So I thought if we link this into places like like trial period pilot projects in places like Totnes, or places that have done the transition towns issues, and rethinking notions of new forms of community. So I've left a few resources, and some on Poland, and there's my burning thumb. Thumb against the burning sky. I've got a book coming out in November, so it's not just the reason I'm doing this, but I want to sort of share a lot of this stuff. So any questions, you can always follow up, and I've got tons of stuff on this. So thank you very much for inviting me and for listening to me. A bit rushed through, but I'm sure there's viewpoints there.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much, Jonathan. We'll move on to Patrizia for our final presentation of the session. So over to you, Patrizia.
Thanks, Greg. So you should be able to see my screen now?
Yeah.
Perfect. So today I'm going to talk about a study that we have developed with the UK Department for Transport during the past year. We have seen a renaissance from shared mobility services over the past 2-3 years, really. But we have seen that most of the time, all the technological change happens in urban areas, and there is a risk that rural areas will be left behind. They already had a public transport which has been severely cut back in the past 10 years, and there is a conviction. People believe that in rural areas we got different market forces, probably because of the lower distribution of the settlements and how people move around and their main habits. COVID-19 has been full of risk, but also opportunities. We had a decline in public transport usage, but the essential works that we have been able to move around thanks to the public transport. And we are seeing an increased use of ICE vehicles. Generally, rural areas are the one with a higher level of car ownership in the UK. And there are also communities which are emitting much more per capita compared to the urban users. But COVID-19 has been full of opportunities as well. The community spirit have emerged in the past year enormously. So even the fact that the public transport was not that popular, but there was a flourish of community-based demand-responsive transport and other type of services which were running on volunteers, basically. And the Department for Transport is looking at setting up the new strategy. They committed to a rural strategy when they published the urban strategy a couple of years ago, and they did a call for evidence in 2021. There was a big engagement which was run by University of Hertfordshire, run by Stephen Joseph last year. And there is a big gap usually when people think are rural. they think that there is a big gap of data. So there is not enough data to understand how people behave, what are their attitudes, especially around the emerging new mobility services. So in this study, we were specifically looking at understanding better everything around all of the knowledge base around the demand for the new mobility services, especially identify those services that could run on a commercially viable basis, and those that really require the subsidy from the local government or from the central government in order to maintain the social inclusion. So we have developed the study in two phases. We are looking at data landscape, understanding what are the data available in the UK in rural areas, and how we can use alternative data sets in order to understand the demand for travel, but also looking at tailored intervention. What are the measures that we should adopt, and being aware in order to make these tailor better these services around the rural users and their travel habits. So we have looked at developing the existing data landscape. So in the UK, we got the census data. We have information from the DEFRA, which is running the rural-urban classification for the rural areas. And we assessed the existing data sets, but also acquired the new type of data source, like the mobile network data, aggregated at trip chains, which are quite different from the traditional approach of the origin destination matrix, which consider, in order to optimize the mobility services, to look at disconnected trips. So how many trips we go between one zone and the other. And we also looked at the distribution of the travel patterns at an hourly basis. And in doing so, we selected three areas, three different, completely different areas across the UK. And we looked at the type of business models that we should adopt in order to make these services successful. So as I said, the rural-urban classification run by DEFRA is purely based on population density. Any type of services in rural areas in the UK is provided according to this measure. We looked instead at the place structure, the geography of the settlings, the type of road network and rail network available, and how many public transport services were running in this area. And in doing so, we selected three completely different areas. So we choose Northumberland in the northeast with lower population density, so South Somerset in the southwest for the largely populated area, and Essex County Council, our most densely populated area, which is closely bonded to the London area as well. So the three case studies actually revealed from a population point of view a demographic which is quite similar, with a lower level of younger users and a higher level of mature adults, and a slightly lower level of working age population. And we have studied the travel pattern looking at mobile network data, aggregated a lower super output area. To give you an indication, if you're coming from different areas of the world, it's a neighborhood level. So between 700 and 1600 households within an area, which is quite high compared to the standard aggregation, which is middle super output area. And we also acquired data across different time periods in order to understand better the distribution of the services during the interpeaks, in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the early evening. So we move away from the traditional classification of peak times that we usually do when we study travel patterns in a urban area. And what we found in the three areas actually is that they got completely similar travel patterns to what you might find in urban areas. Usually they developed a close bond of interdependency with the nearby urban areas. But for example, in Somerset, we don't have any bigger urban conurbation, so there's no way they can attract one town with the others, for example. The residents tend to travel locally and also for leisure, so they're much more relaxed when they choose their mode of transport because the value of time is much lower. And they tend to travel in a uniform way across the day. Of course, we can see that those with a close bond with urban areas tend to have higher simple tours. So just 2 trips in one day, they go to work and then come back. Those in Essex, for example, they tend to have extremely long journey because they tend to reach London, but also travel beyond until the south in Kent and Suffolk. So they tend to have very long peak times, very expanded towards the 4 or 5 hours, both in the morning and late in the evening as well. And we can see also at the same time all the activities that are happening on the logistics sector, so always in an anonymized and aggregated way, which allow us to see that they actually got they rely much more on last mile deliveries and receiving the goods on their doorsteps compared to the urban areas. And we can see this with the high account of trips that they can have on a daily basis. We have, these are data from the 2019, and Northumberland was at 21 trips in one day. They were sourcing the deliveries from the Tyne and Weirs. But for example, in the latest analysis from 2021, these came out at 34 trips in one day. And same as Essex, which got much more local services. In the context, they were reaching 22 trips in one day. You can also see the distribution and how they were collected, looking at the road network. People, for example, in Northumberland, they're able to reach the entire north. They're very well connected with Scotland, for example. But people, for example, in Somerset, they tend to stay in the local areas, and the majority of exchange happens between Dorset and Devon and Wiltshire, so it's all around the Somerset area. Whilst in Essex, we tend to travel, and they tend to travel for the entire east, but reach the entire England. And this is because they got a very good public transport services, both for bus and rail, and a very good road network available as well. But this is what the data are telling us. So they travel more flexibly. In principle, they were much more keen to use new mobility services and shared mobility. On top of that, so we did also some interviews, and we ran focus groups and online communities. The study was entirely done online because of the COVID-19 lockdowns. And then we also structured an online questionnaire, and we collected 1,500 respondents across the 3 rural areas. We also increased the level of respondents in the younger residents and in the older residents through telephone calls. And what we found is basically what the data confirmed us, that those in Somerset are much more reliant on cars, and it's difficult for them to move around unless they got a privately owned car. Those in Essex, they got a good selection of services, so they're much more flexible. But when it's happened to choose a new mode of transport, convenience, speed, and cost are what they matters the most. When we ask them, what would you like to see? If you got a possibility to ask to access a shared mobility services, the mature adults actually, they are the one most risk averse. They actually think that they're not really keen to change their habits, but they think that they will do that in order to help the environment. The younger respondents, that are the ones that are more open to new solutions and to move around in different ways. They're actually more stressed when it comes to use digital platform, registering, connecting their accounts with several other new platforms which are not integrated. So they get stressed, even if they would like to use the services. And the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the use of active travel across all the 3 rural areas. People tend to walk much more, they tend not to commute, and they would like to travel less in the future, but also to use less public transport. Residents consider themselves unlikely to take any new forms of transport. But for example, we did another study, which is actually telling us the rural areas are the one where shared mobility will have a quicker uptake. The new adopters usually are those much more relying on the cars. So they think like using a new type of shared mobility like demand responsive transport is very near to what they had in the past. So they're much more keen to adopt that quicker than other type of users. So we asked them to give us the scoring on the type of mobility services that they would like to see, which was quite broad. The popular one actually was the on-demand transport, both on a community basis or on a commercial basis. So a demand responsive transport that is able to serve that needs. Then for the delivery drones was something that scored really high, considering that they don't know the technology yet and they've never experienced this technology in practice, and also e-bikes and e-scooters. So as I said, the younger respondents are the one more keen in any type of new technologies. And usually the way they would like to access the services is from a booking preference through an app, but also through call centers as well. So because we got an higher presence of mature adults, it is likely that also the operator will offer them the double options, having an app, a digital app on their phones, but also the possibility to talk with somebody and also the website in case they're not, they don't have a mobile phones, but they got a computer at home. So there is a wide variety of platforms that the operators are using to access, and usually the payment preference is toward the card rather than cash. The third part of the studies was actually looking at the type of measures that we should adopt in order to adapt the service to a rural context. Most of the respondents, they were not happy to have a solution completely motivated from urban areas because they say they're different, they got different habits. In fact, they got the same demand, but slightly lower. So you need to adapt these characteristics of the service to the characteristics and the way they move around. So what we studied is a combination of mobility services that could be adopted in any of the three areas. But for the time frame of the project, we decided to study one of each in each area. So we studied the micromobility solution in Essex, the demand responsive transport in South Somerset, and the delivery drones in Northumberland. In each of these areas, we choose 3 towns where we collect data and we specify the type of business models that we might have, and we filled in some business model canvas to understand the features, the characteristics, and what the customers would like to see. We've seen that micromobility really, the measure of success is a strong utilization rate, and having good relationship with both the customers, the local authorities, but also the non-users, because most of the time there are users that they're not consulted at all, and the micromobility vehicles occupy much of the public realm. So a pedestrian path or an area, for example, near a bus stop or a bus services. It's convenient, it's easy to use, it's flexible, it's easy to handle, and they learn to use it quite quickly. But they need to have a good knowledge of where the vehicles are positioned, because otherwise it's difficult. They're environmental friendly, they love the fact that these are all electric, but the key business point is that free floating, for example, is not working in rural areas. You need to be aware that docks are available and vehicles are available in a certain area, points of interest that is widely recognized by the community. And then you also got that the possibility to access that as a subscription or a pay-as-you-ride. Of course, this depends also from the operators. We also run workshops and video interviews with operators in the UK. So we are aware of the various business models that they are adopting in order to de-risk the service, especially when we got the initial uptake. So subscription is more convenient when the service is at the very beginning, but then they usually move to a pay-as-you-ride, like in urban areas. And then it needs to be clear how we can charge the vehicle itself. So arriving to a dock station and charging the vehicle is much easier for the majority of the customers. So as I say, it requires, to conclude, it requires a good utilization rate. There is an appetite for these services, but it's also felt that those short distance could also be walked. So why to have e-scooters as well? It's important that people understand the key locations and characteristics, how to charge it, how to unlock the vehicles, the dock usually is not unlocked it's not locked in rural areas. It's essential that the location where to place them is very important and clear to most of the users. So engaging with the local community is important to design the services, and the impact generated is quite positive because it removes all the traffic that we might have in the small towns and small centers derived by cars, and it's something that allows you to move around much more freely. As a risk, there is a risk for their health. You need to be fit to go on the scooters and being able to face small bumps. The condition of the infrastructure is quite important for that. The other solution, the demand responsive transport, it was the most popular, strongly utilized. There is a positive customer experience, both if it's commercial or on a voluntary basis. The bookings is adapted according to the customers and can be pre-booked or on the spot or just the day before. It's convenient, it's easy to use, especially for the mature adults, so that things the transition much more natural. And what is important is to adapt the way the vehicles are available to customers. So we found that an up-to-spoke model works much more easier. In rural areas, it can be outside the GP, outside the bus stop, outside the commercial or the local shops that you might have in the rural areas. So really, again, finding a focal point is important. The hub-and-spoke model appears to be the most viable, and then this can become a door-to-door service in case the passenger is living in a more remote location, but at least the demand is consolidated in the first one. Timetabling and mixed use could be an option as well. And also having trials, mass trials, to allow them to know the service itself, because it's something that removes the barriers on the utilization of the service. So many of the operators are running the service for special events, to serve hospitals appointments and GP appointments. And it's something that really make these digital services much more approachable and visible to the customers. The delivery drones is something that is still not available on our market, but we consider the fact that you can access this type of service on a subscription basis.
1 minute, please, Patrizia.
Yes, it's the last slide. I'm just skipping the business model analysis. So it requires a good utilization rate. Again, there is a strong appetite, but there is also a need to understand that the new technologies will be not acceptable for the last mile delivery operators. So the use of hubs in order to approach this new type of technology, which will be quite costly at the very beginning, can be quite convenient, especially for emergency deliveries, and serving those areas that are really remote and difficult to reach when the road network and the rail network, or there is no service actually running on that. So to conclude, we found that the data-driven approach really gives a good picture of the travel patterns happening in rural areas. We can see where is demand for travel. We can see the new phenomenon around the goods to people, rather than people going and shopping. They actually prefer to travel much more locally. So there's no typical day that arises from this type of behavior. They prefer to have much more complex trips, but linked to leisure activities, so the value of times is much lower. But as a result, we also produced, we now know that the transferability of the tools that we have generated, for example, to generate activity-based models in urban areas and agent-based models, are now transferable to rural areas. The mobile network data performed much better in some cases in rural areas due to the high level of complex travel patterns that they got. The local authorities can use this tool to plan for an integrated rural mobility services. It's much important to note that rural mobility and urban mobility, that they don't exist in isolation, because much of the pressure and the extra traffic that we are seeing in urban areas is actually coming from the rural areas. And much of the demand for the last mile deliveries is actually coming from the rural as well. So if we fix and think and take care of these burning points. Local authorities can have a way to provide shared mobility services and mixing them in the way that they can serve properly the local users. And mobility providers found the data-driven approach much useful because they get a global view of what the users might desire, and they can tailor the business model around this demand and latent demand the moment that they can't attract. So the next steps at the moment, we are looking at last mile deliveries and how we can integrate the urban mobility services for people and goods, and what are the type of mobility services that we should provide in order to cater for this accelerated trend of last mile deliveries. And that was the last slide, Greg.
Great, thanks, Patricia. A very interesting presentation with